Welcome to episode 42 of the Time Talks podcast, part of the Channel Zero network. I want to thank my friend Sol for the connection for this month's episode. I had the pleasure of speaking to Graham Clumpner and Scott Olsen. Graham Clumpner is an activist, direct actioner, environmentalist, and veteran from the war in Afghanistan. He is also part of the collective Mosquito Fleet. Scott Olsen is an activist, direct actioner, farmer, and a veteran of the Iraq War. Scott was part of Occupy Oakland and went into a coma after being shot in the face with a beanbag round by Oakland police in 2011. In this episode, Graham and Scott speak on the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, anarchism, police violence, imperialism, accountability, propaganda, anti-war action, PTSD, suicide prevention, climate catastrophe, and mutual aid. Thank you to Awareness for the music. Here's a brief jingle from a fellow Channel Zero Network member.
Are you tired of listening to Western experts talking how the world works?
Isn't it a portion of liberal analysis of the uprising makes you fall asleep?
Well, then check Elephant in the Room, an anarchist radio show from European Dresden, where we interview activists who are participating in struggles around the world.
Elephant in the Room is a proud member of Channel Zero Network. You can find our show on your favorite podcast platforms, CZN website, or somewhere on the internet.
From activists
for activists.
This question's for both of you, but I'll start with Graham. And to give some context, I know, Graham, if you could maybe talk briefly about your history and also joining the military. I know you had joined when you were 17 after 9/11 happened, and you were in infantry and also part of JSOC. And I'm wondering if you could talk about what radicalized you or some turning points. This is probably more of a timeline rather than just one point as well, probably a process. And if there was a certain moment, but also why you leaned more towards anarchism compared to socialism or something else, what drew you into that?
Totally. Well, thanks for having us on. I appreciate it. I think it's a really important time to be talking about the American empire and, the connections that it has to everything that it means to be American. Because I think we're often othering these issues and saying, oh, Afghanistan or Iraq, they're different than a budget crisis or different than healthcare or different than mental health. And no, they're actually all connected. So for me, I grew up, I'm an only child, and I grew up in a family of teachers and was always being told that I was supposed to give back in my life. And I was a Republican as a teenager. I was fully on the John McCain bandwagon. This is in the late 1990s, and it's kind of the end of history, Francis Fukuyama period. So I didn't quite have a purpose, and I was looking for some sort of, I didn't know this at the time, but I was, in retrospect, looking to become a man, to grow up, to have some sort of transitionary moment into adulthood, and looking for adventure and looking to get out there in the world. And when 9/11 happened, it was kind of this perfect storm of purpose that it just laid out on a platter in front of me. And I get often asked, how could you join the military at that time? And I honestly feel very much the flip side of that. How could you not? Having lived the life I had lived and had been exposed to traveling as a young kid and seeing seeing genocide on the television and seeing starving people, I really, truly wanted to believe that America could be a force for good in the world, that there was the bad guys and there's the starving people, and someone should get in the middle and help, stop the bad guys from stealing the food and help the starving people to not starve. And it was that simple for me. And, the media and the stories that we told after 9/11 about ourselves as Americans, about the frontier, about what does it mean to be the policeman of the world, to fight an adjective? What do those things mean? Well, for me, it meant joining the military, and I immediately got that purpose. And so, being young and dumb, I wanted to be as close to combat as possible. I wanted to be the badass that I saw in the movies. So I went into the Army, and I then went to basic training. I went to advanced individual training. Then I went to airborne school, learned to jump out of perfectly good aircraft, and then volunteered for a Ranger indoctrination program, which is the precursor to becoming a Ranger. And so all of that training was about 6 months. And once I completed that and didn't fail out, And it's very hard training. Like a lot, we started with 262 guys in my RIP program, my Ranger Indoctrination program, and we ended with 60. So, there was a lot of people getting injured or quitting or dropping out, and no judgment to those folks, but I just wasn't going to quit. And once I got to my unit, this is about the time that like some of the early Iraq invasion stuff is happening. And I had always been like, let's go to Afghanistan. Let's go liberate these people. Let's help the women. Let's put bin Laden's head on a pike and, bring freedom to the world through the barrel of a gun. And I began asking questions immediately upon getting to my unit, because we had Pat Tillman get killed. He was in my company, and there was a cover up that happened pretty quickly. I mean, it's pretty, if you want to, Pat Tillman was a famous national football player. Mm-hmm. And then he quit and enlisted in the army with his brother. And he was killed in a friendly fire incident, meaning, Americans shot him theoretically in an accidental way. And there was a cover up. There was a political fiasco around his death. And I began seeing, just from the inside, seeing some of that stuff. And it was pretty disgusting, but it didn't shake my overall view of the war until I had been there and began to see that what you read in the newspaper or see on television, or at least what the American people were being given information about, was always the rosiest possible scenario. It was always like, 20 people are killed over here, and they're like 20 terrorists were killed over here. It's like, no, they're just people. They're just people. They weren't blowing up anything. They weren't shooting anybody. They're just people, and they got hit by the wrong bomb, or kicking in the wrong doors and finding empty houses, or houses with people that hadn't actually opposed the Americans. Now, after we left, they probably started to oppose us, right? Because you are creating a police state. So by like 2006, the civil war in Iraq was starting to spiral out of control, and Afghanistan was starting to get suicide bombs. And so it began to, and then of course, Katrina also happened, which like had a profound impact on the Bush administration, and their public opinion sank pretty low. And so it began to be fashionable for the Democratic Party and people like Barack Obama and even Pelosi back then to start criticizing the wars. And I began to criticize them too. And I think, the evolution for me was like, I picked up a Howard Zinn book, People's History of the United States in Afghanistan. I've just found there's like little libraries that we have where soldiers leave stuff, and then the next girl picks it up. And I had read that, and I had read some, I was kind of following the anti-war movement at that time, and I was reading some critiques of the war, and, starting to see that all these problems that we were facing didn't necessarily have a solution that was based in violence or force. Put another way, like you couldn't quote unquote, solve the problem of Islam, this is all in quotes here, with a gun. Like if you have disagreements, political disagreements with a group of people, they have to be solved outside of violence. And, it really wasn't until I got home in 2007, and I struggled pretty heavily with alcohol and depression. And I began, it really wasn't until the end of the Obama campaign that I began to turn against the American empire, because I started to see that the Democrats were no different. For a while, I thought, okay, well, maybe it's just because I picked the wrong party. Maybe it's just because, Bush is bad and Rumsfeld and Cheney. You get those guys out, you put in John Kerry or Barack Obama or Hillary Clinton, it'll be better, right? And I began to see that wasn't true. And then, of course, Obama added 30,000 troops to the war in Afghanistan and started the kill lists and the assassination drone program. And so, like, by that point, I was just losing complete faith in the system. And then as, my politics evolved, the reason that I didn't become, I guess, like a party line socialist or, I consider myself a Marxist. I think like Sol says, like I'm an anarchist and a Marxist. I'm both, like you can be both. You should be both. I was always kind of grounded in critical thinking, and I think Chomsky really hit me harder when he, asked those basic questions when he's asked about anarchism. Okay, so what does that mean to you? And he talks about authority and how it needs to justify itself. And that if it can't justify itself, then it's illegitimate. So that was really simple to me. And I think I started out as a fuck you dad anarchist is what I like to call it, where you already hate your dad and you hate authority because you're a young boy. And then you're like, oh, there's a politics for me. That's a coherent set of politics. But then, you dig deeper, you hopefully dig deeper, and you start reading like Emma Goldman, Victor Serge, and you see there's a legacy of critical thinking within anarchism. And you see people like Murray Bookchin, who have these, practical approaches on a municipal level, on a small level. It's not just these grand experiments, and it involves sociology and asking questions about, well, what really is the essence of human nature? Because if we can be clear and honest and accurate about human nature, then shouldn't we structure society in a way that leads us towards the best of our human nature, or helps us, just like a calendar system helps you remember you have an appointment? Shouldn't we have a political system that helps us make better choices that are best for all? And that, was just like mind blowing to me, to see some of the parts of society that are just never talked about, that are third or fourth rail politics, because we're focused on the nation state, because we're thinking about 50 states and 6 colonies and these representatives that we've never met and that don't actually give a shit about our politics. No, actually, politics is like the cost of milk, and whether or not you can afford a car, and whether or not you can get a job, and like what you wear on your body. Like, getting to that level, that personal level, was really appealing to me. And because I think it was empowering. I think it made me feel like I had a stake. And I guess the last thing I would say is, I saw in the military what happens when people are certain, and that scares the living shit out of me. Certainty is a dangerous thing. You can never be certain about anything, and you should always distrust people who come to you with certainty. That doesn't mean you don't take a leap of faith. You take a risk every day when you get out of bed in the morning, but you take calculated risks. You don't just trust. And that goes for religion, that goes for the state, that goes for your teacher, that goes for your doctor. That doesn't mean don't get vaccinated. You should, but like, you trust experts, not authorities, right? And so I think that's what has always made me a bit reticent and nervous about democratic centralism, which is what DSA and some of these new socialists are now calling it, to get away from like Stalinistic shit. I don't equate them at all, just to be clear. But yeah, I mean, I'm a socialist. I'm just a libertarian socialist, which in America makes me an anarchist.
Yeah, and what you're talking about as far as certainty, like the philosopher Obi-Wan Kenobi said, only Siths deal with absolutes. And I had remembered you said on the Soulcast that you joined the army thinking you were Luke Skywalker and found out you were a stormtrooper, which was an awakening while being in the military.
Yeah, it's I think everybody needs to kill their heroes, but my heroes were killed pretty early on in life, and that was a very disappointing moment when I was like, oh, I'm the bad guy. Oh shit, what do I do about this?
Yeah, I really liked how you explained all those different awakenings and how it's still a process that's ongoing. And yeah, thanks for breaking that down. And wanted to move over to you, Scott, and to give some context on this question on what radicalized you and this process. You joined the military in 2005.
Yeah.
Enlisted in the Marines, and then you were doing some IT work along with other work you were doing over there.
Right. I actually initially joined in the summer in 2004, which was between my junior and senior year of high school. But I didn't actually go to boot camp until after I graduated, summer of 2005. So I initially joined when shit had not gone like off the rails in Iraq yet. And then they kind of did throughout my senior year, but I had made a commitment basically, and, I always thought that like I'm a good-hearted and level-headed person, and that my participation, my influence, could have a positive outcome. Quite naive, of course. My primary job in the Marines was data communications and stuff, but I was with an infantry battalion. So, of course, every Marine's a rifleman, and, you get sent out on other things as well. Like my first time in Iraq, it was way out west in Ulaanbaatar when it was 2006, and it's probably the worst time to be in Iraq at the time. Even then, talking to other Marines in my unit, like go on a smoke break or whatever, and it'd always be like, what are we even doing here? What's the point of this all? Having people die from our unit and stuff, it just always made it worse. And then sometimes you just make eye contact with local villagers, and despite the promise that we'd be greeted with roses, like if you make eye contact with some people, like it was very clear we were not welcome. And after some point, like it made sense to me why they were bombing us and why they were fighting against us. I would do the same now in a similar situation. That just started to crystallize for me, and I still always did my best, because it's you have people relying on you to keep them safe, especially after I got out and learned more about the American Empire, how that works, and our historic role, our current role. And that's really what initially turned me against the wars, and then further politically radicalized me. And I wasn't very well politically educated. When I got out, I didn't know much about socialism or communism beyond what they, taught you in school, that it's horrible and you can't do anything. You have no control over your life, all these things. And I associated anarchism with, like punk rock teenagers. And, so after I got out, I began to educate myself. And, I've always had a very like anti-authoritarian personality, I guess. And which is not great for being in the military, of course. But I read some books, and there's nothing really that sticks out for the top, influence. But a lot of what influenced Graham as well influenced me. It wasn't really until after I'd been shot in Oakland by the police that I really dove down deep into political theory.
Yeah, and that was such a emboldening time during Occupy when you were hit with that beanbag round and put into a coma. It was national news. And how long did it take to kind of recover from that? I know you wanted to get right back to the streets after that, or kind of how that time frame was for you.
Yeah, I was in the hospital for about like 2.5 weeks, I think. I had brain surgery. I had to literally relearn how to talk. And there was lots of, like brain trauma recovery in there. And, it's also something that continues. Of course, like the fact that I couldn't talk after I woke up from the coma that OPD put me in, like that was the most primary concern. But with things like any sort of brain injury, there are things that are less noticeable and that are not obvious. And, I'm almost talking to people like currently who have been shot by the cops in the head and have experienced brain injuries. There's a lot that can happen, and you really have to explore what your abilities are and to focus on them.
Yeah, and with the recent protests against the murder of George Floyd, so many people lost their eyes, and just the attacks by police throughout the whole nation was just incredible. So I wanted to move on to the next question now, and that was a recent piece released by CrimeThink titled Afghanistan, the Taliban Victory in a Global Context. It states, throughout our 800 military bases, I do not know of a single military mission that is chiefly focused on creating peace and stability. I was wondering if you could both talk about your initial feelings on Afghanistan now, and if you think this will help people reflect on anti-imperial actions, and if not, ways that people could intervene.
Well, I think there's a famous quote that goes, wars are always fought twice, once in battle and a second time in memory. So a good example of this is Vietnam, where if you had asked anybody in 1975 at the end of the war, at least the end of the American part of the war, who won the war, it would be hard pressed to say that America had won the war. But flash forward to the Reagan era, and you have this reimagining, this rewriting of this valiant struggle that Americans put themselves in, and they were on the correct side of history, and they did the right thing, even if the politicians tied their hands behind their backs, or the anti-war protesters stabbed them in the back, and over time, the legacy of Vietnam has become quite muddled and unclear. And the problem, the challenge, besides like that not being accurate, is that also leads to people not learning lessons, and America not learning lessons. And we had this concept of the Vietnam syndrome for many years, which was this idea of an emasculation of the American male, the lack of a war for young men to go fight, and maybe America's masculinity in and of itself is damaged because we need to go out and kick ass. And you see that over and over again. You saw it when Trump took office and he fired missiles into Syria, and you had all the news media who got us into these wars and professed to hate Trump were saying things like, well, he became a president tonight, and when I see those missiles firing, I get teary-eyed. And this is like, these are so-called media professionals. So I think that we are at a moment right now with Afghanistan where we get to determine how this conflict will be remembered, and to learn or not learn the important lessons that we need to be taking away from this. First and foremost is we should not be fighting wars overseas under any other circumstance than the actual survival of the American people. And even then I have questions because of the massive influence of the military-industrial complex, which is what Dwight Eisenhower, a Republican president, warned us about when he left office. Of course, he did this after 8 years of building up that industrial complex. But we have been struggling really since World War II with too much profit in war. Lockheed Martin makes. If you'd invest in Lockheed Martin 20 years ago, you'd be very rich now. And then you have all these like smaller spin-off company. I mean, even Boeing, General Electric makes our nuclear weapons. Boeing makes bombs. Lots and lots of companies are Microsoft runs the digital programs for the military. So there's a lot of profit. It's one of the last areas in America where there's growth in our economy, and we actually produce things. We have to learn from this 20 years, longest American war, if you do not count the what's called the Indian Wars in American history in the 19th century, 1800s. We have to learn that you cannot force people to become your idea of a democracy. And I don't think Americans live in a democracy by any means, but there was this idea that if we could force people to vote, and this speaks to a larger misunderstanding of the word democracy, but this thinking that just voting in and of itself produces a democratic system. Well, we got people to vote in Iraq and Afghanistan. It didn't change much. And you're going to hear, you've already heard over the last month or so since Kabul fell, this idea that we should have gone harder, we should have stayed longer, but nobody has any cohesive, coherent politics or coherent approach to solve this. They blame the Afghans who, you have to ask yourself, like, why would they fight for a government that was so corrupt and didn't care at all about their interests? Like, we wouldn't do that. So why would we expect somebody else to do that? I think stage one is like getting all of these hot conflicts to end. That means stopping the expansion of AFRICOM, where we are expanding bases and expanding special operations missions. stop the bombing of Yemen, stop the bombing of Syria, get out of the active military role we're playing. And then stage 2 is the rollback of the existing infrastructure. So, there's somewhere around 800 military bases around the world. 177 countries have American military bases. There's a little under 200 total countries in the world. So, it's we absolutely need to move away from this foreign policy footprint that we have that does a lot of damage. I think later in the podcast, I'm going to talk a little bit more about like what the alternative looks like. But, the immediate work that needs to be done is housing refugees, helping Afghans who did get out of the country. There's a whole bunch of ways to do that. And changing our approach, our militaristic approach to problems into one of diplomacy. And for the time being, while we still have nation states, trying to be a better neighbor. that would be the first steps. And just to be explicit, the lesson from Afghanistan is that the only reason to ever fight a war is national defense. And that's a complicated thing to understand, but it's these adventures, these ideological adventures that we have around the world have gotten us nothing but in debt, killed our sons and daughters, damaged our economy, and wiped out countless hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of innocent people's lives.
Yeah, thanks for breaking those different topics down, Graham. Thank you. And Scott, I was wondering if you could talk about some of your initial feelings on Afghanistan now, and your thoughts on anti-imperial actions and that discussion.
Sure. Yeah. The first thing I thought of upon seeing our withdrawal from Afghanistan and what happened there was I was thinking a lot about Iraq in 2013, 2012 with ISIS taking over. Both very expected outcomes if you were following it, knew the players involved. And, I remember then, like Iraq 2014, it was a very unpopular government installed by us to run Iraq. And with us leaving, anybody could have told you that something like ISIS was bound to happen. And yeah, it's hard because, there's the autonomy of the people in Iraq, and what do they want? And the government that we installed was almost the opposite of the government in that Saddam Hussein was running, which was very secular. Many things were reasonably well functioning, at least. And the government that we put in was very incompetent and discriminatory against certain segments of the population.
Yeah, I think it's important to understand that one of the, you asked about whether or not America is trying to produce peace in the world. It's like, well, what we do often, especially when the CIA is involved or the national security intelligence industry is involved, is they play people off against each other. And that's what happened in Iraq. They'll pick one ethnic group, okay, so Saddam was a Sunni, so we're going to work more with the Shias to overthrow Saddam. Well, then that pisses off the Sunnis later on. And then now you find yourself having to pay the Sunnis not to kill you. And we helped create these wedges in the society that were already there. I mean, it's not like America is the one that caused all of these ethnic, political, racial challenges. These things are endemic to any society. It's how you structure society, but we would pick sides, and that extra weight we put on the scale would help tip things one way or the other and help engender even more violence.
Yeah, I think what I'm hearing from both of you is just this violence of destabilization and how colonialism and occupation works. And this was even seen and still seen domestically, like with the COINTELPRO and the Black Panther Party and other groups like that, and just these ways that U.S. power interjects and implodes structures.
Yeah, there's a great book by, I think it's Greg Grandin, called Empire's Workshop, and it talks about how America tested a lot of these ideas in the 19th century, in the 1800s, in Latin America, and then brought them home to the United States and also exported them to the rest of the world. And it kind of traces a good lineage if people are interested.
Thanks, Graham. And yeah, thank you both for sharing those stories. And wanted to move to the next question. This for you, Graham. I know you've been in touch with some people in Afghanistan since the Taliban took over. So I wonder if you could share some stories about the people you have contact with and their perspective right now.
Well, there's a lot of fear. There's a feeling of, I think there's a generalized feeling of some level of betrayal. Some of it very justified, some of it just the nature of, this project was going to have to end at some point. I think a lot of people are discussing the pullout itself and whether that was a tactically well-planned operation. And that's its own discussion to have, but that doesn't take away from the larger point, which is at the time had long past come for America to withdraw from Afghanistan. As for folks on the ground, there's still a couple of folks that I know that are there. They would like to get out. They don't have all the proper paperwork. They don't have a crap ton of money right now. And everybody's kind of in a wait and see. And it's also very important to understand how regionally different, like if you're in Nebraska and you go to Seattle, like there's a cultural difference, but you still speak the same language for the most part. And you still have some of the same cultural touchstones that you can rely on. Like you might go to the bar in Nebraska and watch football, and you might go to the bar in Seattle and watch football. Afghanistan is much different. There's multiple languages. You go like a couple hours away from your city and you might be dealing with not only different dialects, but a completely different cultural heritage or experience. And so, you've got Pashtuns and Farsi ones and Hazaras and Tajiks and Uzbeks. I mean, you've got a massive diversity of cultural and ethnic backgrounds. And so that in and of itself produces it's very difficult to have political cohesion. And so depending on where you are in the country right now, and depending on the Taliban presence, you're going to be facing a totally different scenario. I think the world's focus is always on the cities and especially Kabul, because that's the political center of the country, or at least the international political center. The Taliban historically are more powerful in the east, in Kandahar, especially is where their ideology came from, and they're Pashtun, so they're not going to have a lot of diversity. They just formed their first government. Got a lot of news that it was all male, but it's also like all Pashtun, which is important because they're only, I think somewhere 60 to 70% of the population. I could be off on that a little bit. Things have changed a lot in the last 20 years. So I think, there's a lot of lack of clarity. It's hard to get across the border to Pakistan. You got to climb 14,000 foot mountains in most places. It's hard to get north. You don't want to go into Iran to the west. So it's a hard situation, and there's not a lot of flights happening anymore in and out of the country. But we're talking to folks. We're seeing there are a lot of valiant efforts of people trying to get folks out of there. I think the next couple of months is going to be very painful and interesting. Interesting is a tough word to use, but bear with me on this. It'll be interesting to see the political developments, because look, it's hard to run a country anywhere with an authoritarian tendency. The Taliban are not popular. And they're not going to be, while the Afghan National Army may have laid down their weapons, there will be resistance. We've already seen a lot of marches and rallies and protests. You'll see more. If those are all violently put down, then people will find other ways to resist. This is not an apolitical society. This is a society that has, in some wonderful ways, made some significant gains over the last 20 years, especially when it comes to women's rights and women's awareness about their own power and collective ability to organize. I think that we're going to see the youth in the country, the vast majority, the overwhelming majority, I think 70% of the population is under 30. So it's a very young country, and that usually produces change. Now, what kind of change that will produce, it's anybody's guess. But the future for Afghans is in their hands, and I don't think it all has to be doom and gloom. It's going to be a struggle. It's not easy. I would wish Handmaid's Tale society on anybody. But ultimately, it was always going to be for the Afghans to determine their own future.
Thanks for sharing that, Graham. And then, just to add on top of that, before the U.S. left, there was a recent drone strike that killed 10 before the U.S. left, killing mostly children. Then another thing that I think really ties in is all the DNA that the U.S. intelligence agencies had on almost every person in Afghanistan.
Yeah, I mean, like airstrikes, drone strikes, they're really accurate in a tactical sense. Like if you put the target on a thing, you're probably going to hit the thing depending on the weather. The question is whether you're aiming the target at the right thing. And we get most of our information about what we're shooting at from signals intercepts, meaning we're tapping cell phones, we're triangulating, we're triangulating the cell phones and saying, oh, these three people's cell phones are in the same area. We suspect those three guys or girls, usually guys, to be bad. So we're going to like push the button and drop it. It's not like a court of law where there's the ability to discuss these things. Like these are all kind of questions. So whenever you see a drone strike, I would wait a couple of years to figure out what we actually hit and destroyed, or, maybe a couple of months, because usually the media reaction is initially wrong. What was the second question?
About the DNA on almost every person in Afghanistan.
Yeah, I mean, they're saying that Pakistan has the ability to read that stuff. I mean, like, one of the things that didn't get really reported is we took DNA samples of everybody that we encountered in both Iraq and Afghanistan and built up these massive databases so that, like, if somebody got arrested a second time or whatever, we'd be able to track them better. I don't know. The Taliban are probably going to rely much more on face-to-face communication to be like, hey, where are these people that we want to find? And yeah, I mean, it's a very good cautionary tale for using technology and not practicing the precautionary principle. Like, we should be like, hey, do we need to do this? Do we want to do this? What happens if it falls into the wrong hands? Because I think the last couple of years, being an American has just been a massive crash course in anything is possible. So all you people who are like, that'll never happen, you should always check yourself and think, but it could. What if it did? Should we be doing this?
Yeah, it's kind of the other end of the, if to use the Handmaid's Tale metaphor of the U.S. and its history of white supremacy, doing that with not only hypersurveillance on its own population, but its anti-women policies throughout its history too.
Totally.
I was wondering if you could both talk about how you are accountable to people in Iraq and Afghanistan, what you think about that question and how others can be accountable. I think you kind of touched on that with the anti-imperialism part and the memory of the war. It's a really good point. And I also wanted to point out that, I also consider people in the U.S. who pay taxes as part of this question. I consider myself part of this question as well.
I think it's beyond being personally accountable. I think it's a bigger question of how the state can be accountable. And it was the U.S. government who chose to invade Iraq and Afghanistan. And in some senses, it's the U.S. government's responsibility to fix it, and not necessarily or not at all through continued military occupation. But, it's that old thing. You talk when you're a kid, you break it, you buy it. It's our government's responsibility first and foremost. As far as like, I personally hope the best and want the best for especially the people of Iraq, because I took a place, I played a part there. There's not a whole lot that an individual can do there beyond advocating as much as I can against our wars in Iraq, Afghanistan, and elsewhere. The 10 or so other countries where we're currently doing war, at least. So it's about like ending our current involvement, preventing further involvement in other countries, and helping to rebuild those countries where we have destroyed their way of life and destroyed millions of lives.
Yeah, thanks, Scott.
Yeah, I think there's, I think that the American people are asked often to support the troops, right? And, supporting the troops does not mean thanking them for their service. That is at best a very awkward experience for all involved. And doesn't really get at anything, because when you thank me for my service, like what you're making assumptions about my service, you're making assumptions about how I feel about it. I have to make assumptions about how you feel about it. And it's a whole thing. But if you want,
what service did I provide?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, if you want to say something nice, if you want to recognize that somebody has been through a situation, then welcome them home. Even if they didn't physically go somewhere, they went somewhere in their brain and they went somewhere in their heart. And they're still trying to come back, and they'll never fully come back. And so I think for veterans, we need to demand a number of things. We need to demand that the Veterans Affairs Administration, which provides healthcare, the Veterans Benefits Administration provides healthcare for veterans. That needs to be expanded. In no way, shape, or form should it ever be privatized, ever. There are always going to be problems with the VA, but the problems are primarily funding problems. The staff who work there are great. The veterans get in specialized care there, and there are millions of veterans in this country. And so that would be my first step on just a legislative level. When Scott's talking about the government's responsibility, the government owes reparations, not just to veterans, but also to the people of these occupied territories. And when, we're talking about what kind of role does America play, I think that the role America needs to play in the world and the accountability it has to the rest of the world is to stop trying to change things through violence. But if you want to change things, then make this the best damn country on earth. Get universal health care for all of your citizens, demilitarize and defund the fuck out of the police, invest in addiction treatment, invest in community care centers, invest in public transportation, address climate change, provide access to healthy, union, good-paying jobs for anybody and everybody that's able and willing to have them. Invest in a social safety net that can help people so they don't get put in a position they feel desperate enough that they have to join the military, the biggest gang on the planet, and to go hurt other people to be able to get paid for college. That's the responsibility, especially for the left and for movements that claim to be socialist or communist or anarchistic or even just social justice movements. Like, we have to build a solid, healthy foundation in this country that will then be a model for other people. If Americans are the happiest people on earth, which we're not, if Americans had great health, which we don't, if we were producing all these new ideas and living a totally different way, that could be a model. That is the thing that wins. If you have to have a battle for the country, that's what wins, is a battle of ideas. And we have defunded this country to give it to the plutocrats and the defense contractors for a long, long time. And we've got such a big hole to dig out of. And within that is this culture of fear that has always been there, right? There's always been inequality from the first slaves that were brought here, the first indigenous people that were wiped out, all the way up to the present day. There's always been inequality, but there is an opportunity in this place to create something different and to tell a different story, to live a different way. To like, giving up that privilege is not, for those who are privileged, is not just a process of like changing your language or wearing the right t-shirt or snapping at somebody else in a conference call when they say the wrong thing. No, it's like materially restructuring society. And that work can happen in your municipality, it can happen on your local level. But our responsibility, if you could go 100 years in the future and talk to me, we could look at it and see that America had like systematically addressed a number of these domestic crimes that we've done that have led to our foreign policy fiascos, then the not starting of new wars would be enough. That would be the biggest accountability and gift we could give to the world, is letting other places determine their own future. And we can't stop doing that. So it really comes down to not viewing these wars as just another issue, not viewing the military and its overseas adventures as something that, doesn't affect me. It affects you. We had a financial crash. We got Trump. All of it. We got right-wing paramilitaries walking around this country cosplaying as if they're soldiers. All of that is a product of the post 9/11 world. The spying, the secrecy, the lies, all like those, they've always been there, but they were metastasized after 9/11. And we've got to do a lot of healing domestically to move past that.
Yeah, I love all these ideas that y'all are bringing up, and also giving all the land back that is stolen in the U.S. as well. And yeah, I just love all these ideas that you're bringing up here. Scott, did you have anything to add?
Not necessarily a whole lot. I mean, Graham hit that really good. I just like to add about what he was saying with the VA. It's just a couple days ago that I finally got approved for VA healthcare, and I've been out for almost 12 years. Wow. And people act like we take care of our veterans and all that, whether under no matter which president, but we don't. If you got to fight with the VA for 12 goddamn years to even get basic health care with them, yeah, there's something wrong there.
Definitely, yeah. Thank you for bringing that up and sharing that story as well, Scott. And then I know you both have already touched on this, but I wanted to talk about the media and propaganda. I know one example, Grant, you had brought up was, this may have been in another interview, of when you were in the Chow Hall and CNN showed 18 terrorists were killed, but you were actually in Afghanistan at the time and went to the bomb damage assessment and saw that it was a lot of women and children who were killed. And adding on top of this, the media often doesn't show, injured soldiers, coffins. This is always framed as a false binary too between Republicans and Democrats. But as you all had both mentioned, that Presidents Bush, Obama, Trump, and Biden, are all war criminals and have bombed Iraq and Afghanistan and many other countries as well.
Yeah, I mean, there's, Chomsky, again, is always important to these discussions. He talks about how there's a narrow window of what is tolerable within our media, like a narrow debate. And an example he often uses is about Afghanistan. And in like 2011, the debate was like between, should we add 30,000 troops or should we add 60,000 troops? The debate wasn't, should we have no more troops and bring them all home, or should we have more troops? So the debate that you see is always in a binary, and that dates back to like FCC regulations from the 1950s. I mean, it's like a very historical American media thing. But there's this idea that there needs to be two sides to everything, and the sides that you're given, the field on which you're allowed to play this intellectual discussion is always dictated by, MSNBC, which is owned by Viacom, and CNN, which is influenced by General Electric, both of who profit off these wars. So there's going to be a limit to like what you're able to criticize and talk about. The other part of this that is limiting about the media is, during the Vietnam War, what was so unique about that war is it was the first color television war that Americans ever saw. And it was also the first war where there was just unlimited amounts of journalists wandering around Vietnam. They were free to go wherever they wanted to go. It was very risky, and many were killed, but they were able to get a much more visceral and up close and somewhat honest appraisal of the war. And so you'd hear the military generals say, well, we're turning the corner and there's light at the end of the tunnel. And then you'd hear from a journalist who'd be like, well, actually what I saw is that the South Vietnamese troops were dropping their weapons and not even fighting the Viet Cong, or like all these things disappeared, or this money disappeared, or there's torture going on. And so the American people got these really different views of the war, and they saw Americans dying on television. And at the end of the news broadcast, every single night, there was a list of all the American names that had died and been like publicly released. So the American people, if you were watching the news in the 1960s and the early 70s, you got an idea, still not fully accurate, but you got a more visceral idea of what the war was doing, what it was like over there. And after that war, the military, the U.S. military and the U.S. government did a whole post-mortem on the war. Why did we lose? Why weren't we successful? And they could have said, they could have come to a conclusion like, well, you shouldn't fight a land war in Asia, or maybe we supported the wrong side and we should have supported the other side because they were actually more democratic, or could have come to those conclusions, but they didn't. They came to the conclusion that they got stabbed in the back by the American people, by the anti-war movement, that there was too much access for the media to roam around freely around the country, that you had a draft military, so you couldn't count on people to be reliable, and that people were worried about their families back home. So the military changed a whole host of things after Vietnam. For example, they banned people being able to, they banned the media from being able to show the coffins coming off of the planes at Dover. They started embedding journalists with military units. And when you're embedded with a military unit, you begin to become friends with them. And then when you're shot at by the other side and the guys next to you, the soldiers you're supposed to be objectively reporting on, are shooting back and potentially saving your life, your reporting might go out the window. Your objectivity might stop being so they might be more subjective. They also expanded, they got an all volunteer military. They added women into the force. They started providing benefits for children, health care for the soldiers, a better GI Bill, and that all-volunteer military moved to more specialization. And the one thread running through all of this that changed everything was the technological advances that allowed a smaller military force that was much more highly trained, and it was doing 20 years or 30 years of a career as an individual instead of doing 2 years as a draftee. You could spend a lot more money on these soldiers. You could use better air power and air support, and eventually things like drones and stealth fighters to fight a war differently, so that you didn't have the mass casualties on the American side that the military determined was a primary reason they lost the war. So when you think like about, one of the things that you've seen is like some of these congressmen have proposed, some of the Democratic congressmen have proposed bringing back the draft, because it brings back the accountability for war to the American people. It makes Americans care more, or at least that's the theory. There's an interesting debate about that. But we have separated the civilian and military populations so much, and the thank you for your service culture is a part of that, where I appreciate you, but I can't talk to you about it. And we're not going to interact to have a conversation about what it is you did for me, but thank you for doing whatever it is you did. That separation has made it almost impossible for us to address these systemic challenges.
Yeah, and how it's disingenuous and not authentic in that way. Thank you for breaking that down, Graham. And Scott, how are you feeling on media and propaganda? Can share some stories.
Yeah, sure. Well, I mean, first of all, like just the media just ignoring the wars for basically years on end until, something profound happens that, that is big enough to make the headlines. And until a few months ago, there were a handful of stories about Afghanistan for the past 5 years. And it's not about just ignoring the war wholesale, but also about which stories were told. I remember when I was in Iraq, I worked with the military transition team and the police transition team. Each was respectively did training for the local Iraqi military and the local Iraqi police. And I remember hearing about for months, these Iraqi soldiers and policemen were not getting paid. It was, but basically their pay was basically being embezzled by their higher ups. And you want to ask why? why they might lay down their weapons when the Taliban or ISIS is trying to fight against them. They're not getting paid. And that story was never reported in the American media as far as I can tell. I was in Iraq at the time, so I wasn't following the media at all. But I'm sure you never really heard of that. It's just about like ignoring it and ignoring the stories that make us look bad, that have allowed us to continue our engagements overseas.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that story, Scott. Yeah, it's these type of erasures that just let power keep going and not be challenged and doesn't change public opinion or educate people at all. So, Scott, I want to stay with you. I was wondering if you, after leaving the military, if you could talk about the 2012 NATO action where you threw your medal and just that action as a whole. How
Sure.
It was transformational. Yeah.
Yeah. That was in Chicago, and it was one of the best and most beautiful actions I've been a part of, and the fact that I could take part of it with so many other fellow veterans and a very supportive crowd of tens of thousands, maybe 50,000 people, many of whom were anarchists that organized it and directly supported us. It was a very important release, I think, for many of us, but for me, it was to be able to take these awards, these rewards that really at the time meant nothing. After learning and really reflecting on our participation in those wars and the pain that we caused, and you're going to give me a medal for that? No, thanks. I don't want it. And to be able to, as directly as we could, return it to the generals and the people responsible for those wars. I don't know the right word. Like, it's just very cathartic, or it was really something. And it really caused us to revisit what we have been doing for the past 10 plus years as a country, and to put that on display, and the emotion involved from everybody who did it. Graham was a part of it too. And we all got to say our piece, and we were all very supported by the people there. And then after we were done, we all marched off the flatbed trailer that we had done it on, and kind of marched our way. And like I remember I was in a park across the street sitting down with Amy Goodman. She wanted to do an interview with me, and as we were getting ready for that interview, we started hearing the people screaming. And right when we left, the cops had come out and started cracking skulls and beating people from being there. And, that really just helps solidify the parallels between our military and our police force, because really they're almost one and the same. The police are essentially an occupying force in our country, and they have the same mentality towards civilians here as we did in Iraq or Afghanistan.
Yeah, and that ties into like those urban shield trainings. Some of the IDF does with the U.S. and Mexico as well.
Yeah, I mean, there's always been a pipeline between military personnel becoming police and military equipment going to the police, and they actually give a lot of it for free once it's used in war zones or not left for the Taliban. It often goes to the American police forces and then is used domestically on American streets. I think there is a important distinction between the type of people that make a career in the military or spend time in the military and then make a career in the police force. And, there's a lot of folks that join the military because of the culture they're indoctrinated into, or the economic necessity, or perhaps, like in my case, you truly believe in this mission, but you're doing it for a temporary period of time. You're going on a couple of missions, and then you're coming home and you transition and become a different person. Being a cop, it's like there shouldn't be any. You don't get to be surprised when you enlist in the police force in the United States, and doing violence to your community members and policing them is like a particularly heinous thing. I think there are some models out there. I'm always trying to think about like the alternative, the answer to your dad or your mom when they're like, well, what's your alternative to your politics, honey? Because if we don't fight the wars, what will we do? Because nothing is not enough answer. So here's an alternative. In the city of Eugene, Oregon, there is a program that is called Cahoots, and anybody can look it up, CAHOOTS, Cahoots. And they're like an alternative to the police force. So they work with the police in some ways, in the sense that if you call the police line and you're dealing with like a mental health issue, somebody, you need a welfare check at the house, or suicide issue, or houseless folks are struggling with like a mental health issue and having a breakdown or a drug overdose, those types of things often get farmed out to Cahoots, and they have trained staff that come in and will work with people, talk through stuff, and they have de-escalation training. They don't have guns. They're not treating this as a surgical mission where you have to strap on all your SWAT gear and go kick in a door. There's the writer Radley Balko, who's written a lot about the militarization of the police, and I think some of the numbers I've seen are like 50,000 SWAT raids a year, and a lot of that comes from like boys with toys. Like they want to use the toys, and this idea of to serve and protect. It's like the only protection that police are interested in is protecting themselves. In fact, like there were times in the military where we'd kick in the wrong door, and we would actually pay them some money for the door. Like, whoopsie, sorry guys. I mean, it doesn't make it okay, but it was like there was some semblance of, hey, we don't want to ostracize the community away from us. It's like, yeah, the cops not so much.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, and I think the Oakland City Council in the past few months passed a similar program to what you were talking about, Graham. So similar to what Eugene does. I'm not sure if it's active yet or what, but that's those programs are the bare minimum of what they're really asking for.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up, Graham, and Scott as well. I have to look up the one in Oakland. And Graham, sticking on the militarization of the police and some work you did after leaving the military, you were at the DNC in Denver in 2008, I believe, and they even had a huge warehouse where they were just throwing all the protesters in Denver.
Yeah, so there was the DNC in 2008 was when Obama got inaugurated, and so at that time it was probably the height of the post 9/11 anti-war movement. There were folks from all over the country that came to Denver, and this is also kind of the height of the unsecured convention, where the police and the state hadn't quite figured out how to stop these mass mobilizations that kind of started before WTO and were able to, in some cases, like overwhelm the police forces. But they came out in force in Denver. I mean, there was cops wearing T-shirts to coffee shops that said things like, "I get up early to beat the crowds," with like, a nightstick on it. And so we knew we were going in there, we knew it was going to be not an easy thing. And the group I was with was just demanding a very simple thing, which was demanding that Obama actually follow through and commit to withdrawal by a certain date out of Iraq. And we just wanted to deliver a petition to it. That's it. It's like very simple, but it started out with a Rage Against the Machine and Jello Biafra concert at the old Coliseum. And then we marched a couple of miles with, if you want to get people to march, you give them a free Rage show. And so we had, I don't know, like a couple thousand people marching down the street, and we had veterans up front linking arms and at times, and like kind of and marching, providing like structure and doing call outs and singing. And marched past a lot of people who were around the city, got a lot of press attention, and then got up to the gates around the convention area. And there's like all these riot police up there, and a number of the veterans spoke through like a megaphone and talked about, hey, like I went overseas to fight for the ideals that you police are preventing us from exercising. You're standing in the way of our democracy. And we went and sacrificed, we risked our lives, but we lost people. And there were cops on that riot line who broke down in tears and had to be removed by their superiors from that line because there was a human connection. And the interesting thing about all this gear, all this equipment, one of the things it does is it dehumanizes. Think about when you're driving and you flip somebody off. It's harder to do that if you're walking down the street. You see a guy 5 feet away and you flip him off, like you're liable to get punched. So it's like there's this othering that happens with a gear and equipment, and especially riot gear on cops. And yet that message, that story, this thing that most of those cops we can assume were pro-military, pro-war, very supportive of the troops, or so they thought. And here they were being asked to turn on their own population, the very people that they think are heroes. And those heroes are calling them out and telling them they're full of shit. And I think it was a very powerful moment. I don't know how much long-term impact that has. I mean, that's for every one of those people that was there to determine. But I have to believe, seeing it myself and seeing the emotion of it, I have to believe it had a profound impact on people. And I think that as hard as it is for us as activists and organizers to, we're in the fight every day, and it can get infuriating, and it can feel like the enemy is pure evil and the other side or the other sides are all out to get us. And they are, and that's true. But we got to be the adults. We got to be the bigger people when it comes down to it, because otherwise, like, it's just war. And listen to it from two veterans telling you, we don't want more of that. That's not the solution to this country's problems is more war. We're going to have to compromise. None of us are going to get everything we want. That doesn't mean we bend over. We fight, but it's hard. I mean, just to be clear, there are some war criminals that they don't get, we don't, they're going to jail or whatever our anarchist utopia solution for war criminals is, but they're not going to be like deciding members of the future society. But for the most part, for most people, we got to find a way to forgive each other and live together.
And you Graham, you were talking about how you weren't sure about the impact that DNC events had on other people. I remember my last year in the military looking at YouTube and coming across a video of IVAW, Iraq Veterans Against the War, at the DNC, and I was floored. I thought, this is a group that I need to be involved with when I get out. This is going to be good for me, and it's a way for me to make up for what I'm done.
Well, that's really good to hear. I didn't know that.
Yeah, that's awesome. Before you said that, Scott, I was just going to say, you never know what seeds that can plant, but obviously that seed bloomed quick. So Scott, if you want to start out with this next question, I know you've talked about the GI Rights Hotline and Courage to Resist. And just to frame this question, I know this can be a really vulnerable time for veterans, people who've served, who've been scarred and traumatized by war. Issues like PTSD can be triggering. There's been a rise in suicide. Can you all speak on this challenging time and some resources or places to reach out to, or just some general feelings around that topic?
Of course. And I mean, it's been a very rough time for me this past month or two. Especially if you're in the military, there's always a way out. It's not easy, but you can get out. The best way to do that is to call the GI Rights Hotline. Look them up on Google, GI Rights Hotline, and they have some wonderful volunteers working there. They'll talk to you no matter your situation. They'll do your best. They'll do their best to get you out with minimal repercussions. PTSD is always rough. Anytime war is really in the media and in a big story, it makes me reflect and makes me think about things that are not necessarily in the news. You know, I'm lucky that I have people who I can talk to and unload on, but not everybody has that. The best advice is not do your best to get involved with a VA or a counselor, therapist, a good friend, family member, and just talk. Of course, somebody who's understanding, who you might know.
Yeah, the Rights Hotline is 1-877-447-4487. And they've helped a lot of us out. They're usually just volunteer folks that know a lot about the military and know a lot about the rules and regulations. And, just like the military is just a subset of American society. There are socialists, there's anarchists, there's women, there's men, there's trans folks, there's queer folks, there's gay folks, there's black, white, brown, red, everything. And there's a lot more connection that is needed from the civilian population and the military population. So anybody can do it. Just open your ears and talk to folks and ask questions and be willing to listen.
Yeah, and I wanted to thank both of you for spending time to talk with me, because I know that this talk can open some wounds too, but they're really helpful stories to share. And I just wanted to thank you all for both sharing these stories.
Welcome.
So this next question, I've heard you talk about this, Graham, about climate change in the military, and that the military and Navy alone are the world's biggest carbon emitters. So I was wondering if you could both talk about how climate change is going to lead to more instability and more wars. And also, like, if you see climate change leading to parts of the U.S. breaking down, or what type of futures do you see?
So, Scott, I'm going to have you talk more about the United States and climate breakdown here, like what that can mean.
Sure.
But when it comes to, like the U.S. military has been tracking climate change for a lot longer than politicians have been interested in it. And the reason for that is because it's known as a force multiplier. What they mean by that is take a country, any country, say Syria in 2010, you've got already existing issues. You've got a youth demographic that's growing older and putting pressures on the social institutions to provide more jobs. You've got a drought that comes in and produces really crappy farmland for about 1.5 million people who then are out of work. Those people then move to the city. They start demanding more jobs. There's some protests. The government decides to shoot people and a whole revolution starts. So that's just one example of the historical events that have been instigated by climate change. So you already have these problems in society that every country has them, as I said before. But climate is a forcing. It's that extra push at the end of the diving board that pushes you into the shark-filled ocean. And there's a whole host of ways it could happen. I mean, it could happen from wildfires or floods. It could happen from hurricanes. It could happen from drought. It could happen from heat waves, all of which, interestingly enough, we've already had in America in the last 2 months. So we're seeing this all over the world. It's a differentiated experience. So the poor get it the worst and they get it first, but it does affect everybody. It's affecting our supply chains. And from a military standpoint, like if you can't get gasoline to your vehicles, you can't fight the war. If you have no access to water, you can't fight the war. If more countries are being destabilized and they're producing climate refugees that are coming to America, holy crap, you've got a whole host of political problems that you have to deal with now. So the military since the early 2000s under the Bush regime was deeply concerned about this. And it was talked about while we were in the military. There was a massive drought in Afghanistan while I was there, and that was leading people to grow poppies instead of wheat. So these are you could pick a country, any country in the world, and there are climatological forcings that are making everything else that is hard about being human and living in society with other humans, it makes it harder. And sometimes it makes it impossible. And the real fear is the impossible part. The real fear is the tipping points, the things like, methane melting out of the Arctic. But for me, what keeps me up at night, especially after watching the 4 years under Trump, is the climate refugee situation. Everything that is Trump and Brexit and the far right uprising that exists, especially in Europe, but also a bit in the United States of the last 6 years, all of that can be traced back to Syria, which can be traced back to a combination of climate change and America's invasion of Iraq. What I mean by that is that when we invaded Iraq in 2003, a lot of people, millions of people, were displaced. They had to move internally within Iraq, and some of them crossed the border into Syria. And that destabilized the Syrian government. It made it harder for them to provide security. It made them more paranoid. It made them more militarized. And so by the time 2010 rolls around and there's a drought, this then is the kick that really pushes it over the edge, and you find yourself in a civil war. And what does that produce? Out of the Syrian civil war, millions more Syrians flee out of Syria, and they try to get to Europe. And that then leads the European Union to have its greatest crisis it's ever had. And they're trying to make decisions like, should we have refugee quotas? How do we prevent so-called terrorists from sneaking into our borders? And different countries are handling it differently. Germany originally took on a bunch of refugees. Bulgaria did not. And there became tension over that. And then once the Paris attacks happened, the ISIS Paris attacks, the whole backlash started. And suddenly all these white European citizens started seeing the immigrants as a threat. And that made them elect more right-wing governments, and like you see in Hungary and in Poland, it led them to closing down their borders. It led them to voting in the UK, voting for something like Brexit, which if you'd asked a couple of months before the election, no one in their right mind would have predicted that would have passed. Same thing with Donald Trump. That became a refugee thing, which a lot of the refugee challenges that the United States faces is, if you want to frame it as a challenge, but the way that is starting a lot of times is because of capitalism and climate change. And so my thing that keeps me up is the climate refugee challenge of the future, because it's more likely than not going to produce incredible backlashes in society that can create a perfect storm where a dictatorship or a fascist entity can take power. They could take advantage of that anger and that hatred. And especially when the rest of a society is already being nickeled and dimed and screwed over by corporate capitalism, it's a brush fire waiting to happen, if I'm going to mix analogies or whatever the hell that is. It's a tinderbox and waiting to happen. And so the work that we can be doing now is to be working on refugee issues before it is such a bigger issue. And it's already a massive issue, but like before we're talking like tens of millions as opposed to millions of people, because there's a whole bunch of the world that no matter what we do is not going to be habitable very soon. And a lot of that is drawn right through the center of the Middle East. And those people are going to go somewhere because they have a right to live.
Thanks for breaking that down, Graham. Go ahead, Scott.
So first of all, I'm sure most listeners know that the Pentagon has been taking climate change very seriously for probably 10 years at least by now. And that's for foreign and domestic issues. Like we've all seen over the past few years how bad things are getting. And it's getting to a point where we're having internal climate refugees. I've had a couple of friends of mine relocate from the West Coast to the Northeast, mostly to escape the fires. And we'll probably see this with these recent hurricanes in Louisiana. People they can't go back to their homes. Even around me, I'm in the upper Midwest, probably one of the most isolated and best places for looking forward for climate change. But in the past 5 years, I've gone through 2 1,000-year flash floods. I've had to do like demolition and recovery work on places who were just flooded out. These are skills that we all need to develop if you want to support our neighbors. The state's not going to be there for us. They're not gonna. They might have FEMA come down, and in 18 months or something, you'll get a payout for your now flooded out property. That does not do any good today when you need it. There's no end to understate how unprepared this country is for climate change.
Yeah, thanks, Scott, for talking about that. And yeah, we've already had hundreds or even thousands of people die from climate change just in the U.S., let alone the rest of the world. And talking about preparedness, one of my questions for you, Scott, was if you could talk about the farm work you do and what you've been working on.
Sure. I've got a small farm here in where I live, and I raise some bees and some chickens and some stuff for self-sustainability. But I've made it a point to just offer things for free to my neighbors, whether they're neighbors who are right down the street or a couple miles away, with the intention of basically building a mutual aid support network. And so some people have politics that aren't ideal, of course, but sometimes, as long as they're not like extra shitty, it's not all that important who they have voted for. It's important that they're your neighbor and you may rely on them as much as they might end up relying on you in the near future. Because, like I said, we're gonna face these disasters more regularly, and I've done all sorts of work for neighbors who have been destroyed by natural disasters, and of course I ask for nothing in return, but it's important to be there and to be a caring person, and that's the best way to spread anarchy, just to do small a anarchism, basically.
Yeah, I think you're right, Scott. There's something there with, like, I've been thinking a lot lately about how do we focus on people's behaviors and not their thoughts or ideologies, because even with, like, recently we had the Capitol riot, and the Democrats are trying to lead a 9/11 commission into it. And I've been thinking about this because I've studied extremism for a long time, and from a lot of different angles, whether it's like religious extremism or political extremism, and just trying to understand, like, how do you work with, can you de-radicalize people? Is this going to backfire if the FBI suddenly starts doing Waco and Ruby Ridge raids again? They start taking people's guns. Like, it's probably going to lead to some backlash. So I've been thinking about this, and it's like, I think that the key, and I don't have all the answers, but I think the key is just focusing on the behavior. It's not that these people are right-wing nut jobs who stormed the Capitol because of QAnon or whatever. It's they stormed the Capitol. They did a thing that is like that we need to focus on. And I think if we can get it into our heads as with our neighbors and our community members that, like, just because somebody voted or they wear a t-shirt or they present a certain way, like, you can still meet them as a human. If they treat you shitty or they hurt you, that's different. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm just saying, like, the prefiguring that we do, I think we've all got to get a lot. I know I have to get a lot better at it.
Yeah, I think the that shitty margin that Scott pulled out was a good point that you tapped into too, Graham. And yeah, what I'm really hearing is that you're going to be safer with mutual aid in a community rather than inside of a bunker, and reaching out to neighbors and people is just a good way to fight this general alienation that capitalism brings us when, we're all taught to be consumers, but we're not taught to give give a neighbor or someone some squash that you grew. And these are like just great starting points for solidarity. Yeah, thanks for sharing that. And Graham, just my last question. I was wondering if you could talk about your work with Mosquito Fleet, kind of what that is, and some actions you've worked on, like these actions you did against Shell, and some other work you do surrounded with climate change.
Yeah, so I like I said about climate change, I kind of stumbled on climate change while I was in the military and became very concerned and afraid and interested and fascinated, because it's the issue that connects every other issue. It's like, what do we all breathe the same air? I'm not trying to sound like John Kennedy, but we all inhabit the same planet. We all breathe the same air. We all live in a climate system that has a balance that's good, and when it's out of balance, it's bad. It's just like objectively bad for human existence and our ecological system that we've evolved into. And so I just became very interested in it. I went to grad school for it, studying like climate change and militarism, and got into this organization called the Mosquito Fleet that we kind of revived. And the idea was to get kind of a rangy group of like direct action folks together to go put our bodies in the way of fossil fuel infrastructure on the water, whether it be coal, oil, or gas. None of it should pass. And we did a lot of different actions on different campaigns. The idea was like, when everything else breaks down, the negotiations, the legal support, the asking nicely, the moral pleas, when those things didn't work in stopping a new pipeline, we would go out and stop it ourselves. And hopefully that would then be a catalyst or a push point where more people would join in, and we'd grow our power. And it's been quite successful. I think, in fact, more successful than any other work that I've done on the left. And the biggest victory we had was we stopped Arctic drilling. And when I say we, I don't mean the Mosquito Fleet. We were a part of it, but there was the Arctic drilling is a battle that's been going on in the Arctic, or in Alaska specifically, for over 25 years, and led by indigenous communities that have been there for time immemorial. And they were fighting on the ground and asking for support, and a lot of other groups got behind them. And it kind of culminated in the Pacific Northwest for a couple of reasons, but primarily because Shell, which is the primary driver behind the Arctic drilling project, had to have a winter harbor for its ships. It had a fleet of like 20 some ships that it needed to store outside of the Arctic, because the Arctic freezes, and it's not good for your ships if you're trying to drill all the time. And well, the places that they stuck them in Portland and Seattle and Everett, those places aren't pro-oil communities, shall we say. So we were able to mobilize tens of thousands of people to do all numbers of actions. And like the direct actions on the water and the hanging from bridges to block ships, like those things were sexy, and they were the ones that kind of got a lot of attention. But there was old raging grannies who sat in wheelchairs, like chained to concrete blocks in front of the shipyards. We worked with longshoremen and union guys and tried to convince them to walk off the job. We ran 2 campaigns that successfully removed city council or port commissioners that were deciding to keep the ships there and not telling the people of Seattle. We blocked Shell facilities on land. There was petition drives. There was door knocking. So it was a beautiful encapsulation of what the movement can be at its best, which is everybody's welcome. Every piece of input can be utilized to put pressure on the bad guys, on the target, to get you what you want. And you have a long-term strategic vision of like, okay, we want to end Arctic drilling, but in the short term, we want to deny their ability to utilize Portland and Seattle as home bases for these fleets. Why? Because we believe that if they can't use those ports, it becomes cost ineffective for them within capitalism, within their world that Shell lives in, to function and to operate and to continue the drilling, which ultimately is what happened. There was so much opposition that there was an economic calculation somewhere in the depths of Shell's corporate headquarters that they couldn't continue to do this and also make a profit. It was just too risky. And so oftentimes with these pipeline fights or extraction, export, import terminals, what we're trying to do is we're trying to bring essentially true cost economics into the thing. Like, it's just like the same thing where nonprofits in America, often their sole job is just to make the government do its job it's supposed to do anyway. Like it's kind of what the left in direct action is doing. It's just being like, Nope, we're gonna make it cost what it actually costs to drill up dead dinosaurs and then burn them into everybody's lungs and black out the sun. So we do that up and down. It's a Cascadia organization. We work in the Cascadian mountain region, so from like Alaska down to Northern California, Washington, Oregon, British Columbia. And if there's a pipeline or an oil terminal that they're trying to build or expand, we fight it. I think the real big question about what comes next is how do we roll back existing infrastructure? And meaning like how do we close coal, oil, and gas plants and get the transition hyper fast towards, you want to call it a Green New Deal, whatever. I mean, I've been thinking a lot about what a Green New Deal, how that could be incorporated into demilitarizing our foreign policy. So you have over 1 million people that are active duty in the military. We need to give them alternative jobs. If we want to just end the military, so you want to take 1 million people who are trained with weapon systems and make them unemployed? That's a recipe for bad. We need to take those folks and we need to, give them some sort of transition. And we should also be doing that with the unemployed and the underprivileged in this country. Like we should be prioritizing certain segments of society that have been historically overlooked and historically disenfranchised and provide them entryways into a future economy that can actually work as we try to do this long haul radical revolutionary process, right? We're trying to get to this utopia, which is no place, but we're trying to get to shoot for the stars, you get to the moon. And in order to get there, we've got to have buy-in from a whole bunch more people in society than we do right now. I mean, if you want to get to a general strike scenario, you got to have significant amount of people off that fence and on our side. And I think when we talk about this and we talk about these big goals, and I'm trying to like kind of encapsulate this whole conversation. When we talk about that, we've got to talk about the one certain thing that's coming down the proverbial pipeline, which is climate disruption. And sometimes it'll be chaos and disaster, and sometimes it'll be opportunity. And when I say opportunity, I mean it's an opportunity for us to change how we live, how we relate to each other, how we structure cities, how we structure transportation, how we structure education, like what it means to be a citizen. Like these are all questions that are on the table right now. And that's incredibly interesting and fascinating. It's a great opportunity. It's also the hardest work human beings have ever had to do. And we're going to lose people. I think about it like a war. I think about it like in terms of we need to mobilize, but instead of another group of people based on their skin color or their beliefs, this is a very, very small group of people who run the fossil fuel industry and who directly benefit from it. Very, very small group of people that this war is against. And then the effects of their actions, which is the actual climate disasters. And so we need to do a number of things like refocus on the United States, stop these stupid, pointless relationships with countries like Israel, the United Kingdom. It doesn't provide any strategic benefit to America to be friends with these countries. You know what it does? Mexico and Canada, because they border us, because we cross those borders, we interact. There's many Canadians and Mexicans in America and vice versa. That's a worthwhile place to have like international relations, bring all the troops home, start to demilitarize, get rid of the low-hanging fruit. Like you don't have to have as many nuclear weapons. You don't have to have tanks. We don't fight wars like that anymore. There's a whole bunch of shit right around the edges you could chip away at, pass some global restrictions, have the U.S. come out and pass global restrictions on weaponized and automated drone warfare. I think like there's a small window we have left before everybody's got weaponized drones. And that's not a world that I want to live in. So like, while we still can, let's try to lead the world into a global, like almost like a nuclear arms treaty, but like one that bans future drone warfare. Abolish NATO. It's time. There's no more need for NATO. It just pisses Russia off. It's time for that, for NATO to go away. Give it 5 years and we'll kill it all. We need to redirect all that, those trillions of dollars. We spent $6.5 trillion in Afghanistan, more in Iraq. We need to redirect that money back into actual emergencies, remediation for after climate disasters. We need, we talked about it earlier. We could do healthcare. We could do a whole bunch of things with that. But if we want to really survive an actual national security issue, if you want to use that terminology, it's climate disaster. It's fucking coming. It's more dangerous than anything else. It's already here. And yeah. We have an opportunity. We have a moment, and it's up to us to write how that history will be remembered.
Thanks, Graham. You grabbed like 3 bookends and put them there. So I really appreciate you framing this conversation and bringing it back. And that's awesome. Did you have any last thing to add, Scott?
Yeah, I mean, like what Graham said, we're moving forward, and as far as Afghanistan goes, that war's not over. We will most likely continue to have, as Biden has put it, over the horizon capabilities there, which means drone strikes, as we do in likely a dozen other countries. So these wars aren't over. The focus needs to be here and taking care of our own problems here.
And my last message would be support the troops, because you're going to need us to overthrow the government.
Thanks, Graham. Thanks, Scott.
This song's about the difference between a soldier and a warrior. You see, a soldier is loyal. A soldier is technically and tactically proficient. A soldier follows orders. Now, a warrior ain't so good at following orders, because a warrior follows the heart. You see, a warrior has empathic understanding with the enemy, so much so that the very thought of causing pain to the enemy causes pain to the warrior. You see, a warrior understands that we fight to make a stand, no matter the injustice we might see. And I'm telling you that's nothing but the truth. I'll be the best warrior I could be. Now, my veteran sisters and brothers and I had heard that NATO generals were going to be meeting in Chicago in early 2012. And we thought we'd give them the opportunity to honor us as warriors by returning our medals. So, we let them know what we wanted to do and told them we wanted them to ceremoniously receive them, and they refused. So we decided we were going to march straight to the gates of that summit and throw them back, because we were seeking a rite of passage in the warriorhood. And we wanted to show the world that this country still has warriors. It was a hot and sunny day in Chicago as we lined up to march down the road. With 20,000 strong, there was nothing to go wrong as we sang songs through every barricade. Now, I held my head high as I marched beside my sisters and brothers in arms. And there's no better day than the day that we marched to the gates of the NATO barricade. I said, now a warrior understands that we fight to make a stand, no matter the injustice we might see. And I'm telling you that's nothing but the truth. I'll be the best warrior I could be. Now, we carried our flag next to the Afghan flag to show the world where we stand. Surrounding us was a circle of trust by veterans of many wars past. And their eyes sang songs as they marched along streets that were paved with police. And that's okay, because they led the way straight to the NATO barricade. I said, now a warrior understands that we fight to make a stand, no matter the injustice we might see. And I'm telling you that's nothing but the truth. I'll be the best warrior I could be. I was a soldier for too many years. I caused my fair share of war and fear. But that all changed the day I took the stage and told the world why I was there. I said now I'm headed crazy can be. So today is the day I give my medals away, so I can be the best war I can be. I said I'll be the best war I can be. Now a warrior understands that we fight to make a stand, no matter the injustice we might see. And I'm telling you that's nothing but the truth. I'll be the best warrior I can be. I said now a warrior understands that we fight to make a stand, no matter the injustice we might see. And I'm telling you that's nothing but the truth. I'll be the best warrior I can be. I said I'll be the best warrior I can be. I said I'll be the best warrior I can be.
That was the song Warrior by Jacob George. Jacob was an Afghan vet and a good friend to Scott and Graham. He died by suicide in 2015. I'd like to thank everyone for listening to this episode. I'd like to thank Graham and Scott for speaking to me. Their links to more about them is in the show notes. Thank you to Awareness for the music. Thanks for supporting the show on Patreon and sharing links with friends. And see you all next time.